Hello, and welcome to the Narrowing Path, walking the spiritual walk. My name is Steve Van Eiderstein. Thank y'all for joining me again tonight as we do the next chapter reading from V.C. Kitchen's book, I Was a Pagan. This is the copy we're going to be reading out of. This is from 1934, and you can also buy this if you don't want to buy one of the originals. You want one that you don't feel bad about marking up, you can get this one. It's retitled Believing in False Gods, but it's the exact same book. And then the subtitle is I Was a Pagan by V.C. Kitchen. I'm sure for copyright purposes or whatever. But we will be reading out of this one for today. So if you like the content on this channel and you enjoy what we talk about on here, please go ahead, give us a like, give us a subscribe, and go and follow us on Facebook. And we also we are also on Spotify Music and Apple Podcasts if you'd like to go check us out there too. So we're going to be reading chapter 11. I can't believe we're on chapter 11 of this book already. And it's called This Business of Being Remarried. Wedlock. When romance went out of marriage, I came to the profound conclusion that no one man and no one woman could give each other everything they needed. And I worked out an idea of a sort of communal marriage where half a dozen women, including a good cook, a good mistress, and a good mother, and a half dozen men, including a good moneymaker, a good lovemaker, and an intellectual or two, were to marry, and thus extend the range of talents and satisfactions to be found in one and the same family. I considered this idea very advanced. So, no doubt, do the free thinkers who demand free love, companionate marriage, more liberal divorce laws, and other forms of easy promiscuity. Actually, of course, these ideas are not advanced. They are very much old stuff. Even companionate marriage dates back to ancient Hindu tribes and has long been practiced among the Turkomans, as well as in Ceylon and the Andaman Islands. Monogamy, therefore, is by way of being the very newest and most modern form of matrimony. Far from having been tried and found wanting, monogamy, as G.A. Studdard Kennedy suggests, has been tried, found difficult, and not tried enough, which has scarcely even been tried. There is one form of monogamy, however, which has scarcely even been tried. Its name is holy wedlock. I do not mean simply a marriage sanctioned by the church. There are plenty of those which are far from holy. I mean a marriage entered into neither for its selfish sensuous satisfactions nor for its social economic consequences, but for the purpose of spiritual growth. I mean a marriage where both parties contract not only with each other, but with their maker. I mean a marriage which successfully and joyously carries out the marriage vows. I mean a marriage in which bride and groom fully and freely surrender self-will, not becoming a henpecked husband or a submissive wife, but a man and wife handpicked for each other under God's guidance and submissive to his will. Other forms of wedlock may as well be called deadlock, for they simply mean the bringing of two self-centered people together, each revolving on a different axis and thus bound to clash. They may tolerate each other as long as they are nice to each other. I liked my husband, as one wife admitted, because of the nice way he treated me. But when this treatment begins to cloy, when romance flattens like stale champagne, they soon enough return to their own self-centered ways of living. I have seen mothers train their daughters before marriage to gain and hold the upper hand. These mothers had long since learned that the give and take of marriage is largely a matter of just giving in today, so that you can get the better of your better half tomorrow. Such relationships wear thin. I feel, because so often they are based on nothing but convenience, or on a matter of purely physical affinity. So far as I was concerned, I wanted to be free to mix social cocktails under my own roof as already stated, and I wanted a lot of other things I could indulge myself in more freely and fully if I had a wife to give me opportunity or an excuse. There came a time, however, when the solace offered by these early satisfactions grew a little thin and gritty. I continued married life more as a duty than as a pleasure, but I still felt pangs of conscience when I thought of other women. Fidelity I considered as a duty to my wife, to my children, and to social custom. I was also a bit afraid I might get caught. Like many other dutiful wives and husbands, we tried to maintain this semblance of a smoothly running marriage. So, to the world and even to each other, we pretended everything was all right. Under the calm exterior, however, was a constant conflict of desires, a conflict of self-centered egos, unremittingly at war. Continuance on this suppressed conscientious level cried out for escape. The usual attempt at escape lies in some form of advanced thinking, a taking up of the new freedom which offers an easy excuse for slipping back into the old immortality without more ado. Then perhaps may come divorce, which in 90% of the 90% of the investigated cases is due to selfishness and nothing else. Divorce, of course, is not an avenue of escape. It brings no sublimation of the old self-indulgent desires. No separation from a life partner can separate one from oneself. The first divorce, therefore, is likely to lead to a chain of divorces in the hopeless attempt to get away from one's own personality, and with never any attempt to develop those inner qualities which can lead to happy marriage anytime and anywhere. My wife and I did not get as far as divorce. While as selfish and self-centered as the rest, we had learned like turtles to pull our heads when we saw trouble coming. We learned to go on having our own ways without much surface friction, though the friction continued to grow inside. I, in fact, began to sample some of the easier methods of escape, which I called just seeking a little variety. My wife, meanwhile, approaching the dangerous age, was caught in an emotional net which she hated with all her soul, yet could not escape. Then we met the Oxford group, and I learned a real way of escape. It is strange I had never thought that there might be two exits from a conscious strained relationship. An exit leading to an upper level of living as well as the drop to a lower one. We have found escape on the upper level. We have found escape in holy wedlock instead of in communal marriage, companionate marriage, free love, or divorce. We have found... Excuse me, I apologize. We have found in Christ a full answer to every problem of our marriage as to every problem of our lives. We have found in Christ a full answer to every problem of our marriage as to every problem of our lives. I do not mean, of course, that the problems were all solved in a day. We are still very far from a perfect family. We are all still tripped up at times by ego and fall into many forms of selfish sin. Instead of growing away from each other, as in the past, however, we are steadily growing towards each other and into the sort of match that is really made in heaven. Our problems are not all answered, but our problems are not all answered, but they are being answered. And I have seen enough Oxford group families further advanced than our own to know that Christ is a positive and unfailing answer to divorce, to infelicity, infidelity, disobedience, strain, incompatibility, nerves, sexual maladjustment, overconscientiousness, irksomeness, temper, irritation, disagreement, and every other form of marital disunity and woe. It's a big sentence. Just the other night, for instance, I heard a man discussing harmonious sex relations as the key to a happy marriage. A few years ago, I would have heartily agreed. I now know, however, the true harmony lies much deeper than sex, and that even harmony in sex itself, not only in man's and woman's attitudes towards each other, but in their attitude towards God. I have found, in fact, that an experience of God means far more than a new charge of strength flowing into the will. It means far more than a new direction and a new power to choose correctly and rightly. It also brings a new affection, strengthened, invigorated, cleansed. There is something wonderfully fresh, vital, new, and full in the cleansing breeze of the Spirit. There is a bubbling up and flowing over, not of the old and sickening physical affinity, but of new and purified outgoing and self-sacrificing love. God, we have found, is not only the answer to disharmony in sex relations, not only our guide, counselor, and friend, not only the giver of a new purified affection, he is judge, provider, stabilizer in all psychological and economic difficulties which arise in the intellectual and social areas of marriage. I was suffering, for instance, from what psychologists might call a sense of juvenile omnipotence, carried over into middle age. As a newborn babe, I had gathered the impression that the entire universe revolved around me. I was the center of everything. The whole world had no other function than to contribute to my comfort and support. This impression was never dispelled. When I married, therefore, I naturally expected my wife to fall into this procession of encircling satellites, only to learn that she had gathered some of the same omnipotent sense in her own infancy and expected to find a dancing attendant in me. A self-willed adult infancy was indeed a psychological difficulty, but it had no psychological cure. The only remedy we found was to go back to infancy, this time a spiritual infancy, and re-begin our lives as satellites in one and the same orbit revolving around Christ as the center. Economics are often blamed for marriage difficulties when emptiness of the spirit, rather than the pocket, is a real source of woe. Economic worries, for example, are supposed to wear a husband-wife relationship to the ragged point. And too much poverty, too many children, too little food, or too many bad companions are supposed to snow a couple under until they have no thought or time to work out a domestic harmony. This once was so in my own case. My family suffered from bad business, not for lack of something to eat, but for lack of that in me which would enable them to rise above despondency and annoyance. And each break in the stock market brought me nearer to a break with my wife. Today, however, I am much nearer being really broke than I ever was before in my life. And yet, at the same time, I am much nearer to my wife and children. Economic difficulty is not the cause of marital difficulty any more than is a false psychology. In our own case, in fact, it had been the very reverse. Through teaching us a far deeper dependence upon God, it has brought us into a far deeper unity, and is thus the best thing that ever happened to the members of my household. We are, in fact, happier and more harmonious now than at any time during prosperity. And there are married people in the group who live entirely on faith and prayer, yet who are the happiest couples I know. Even in the dark ages before my change, I could see that biology, psychology, and economics were not the real or basic causes of domestic strife. I attribute it rather to an unsound philosophy, the fact that men and women failed to see what they were really living for, and that they chose to live selfishly in consequence. My wife, meanwhile, attributed it to fundamental difference in men and women, which gave us different viewpoints and made it impossible for us to see eye to eye. I know now, however, that while philosophy may change or repress the destructive effects of selfishness, it never sublimates them. They are sure to break out anew somewhere else. And my wife now knows that it was not fundamental differences in us that led to difference of opinion. It was the fundamental sameness, the fundamental ego in each one of us, which led to the assertion of self-will. We are a different man and wife today, but that is not due to anything we have learned about biology, psychology, economics, or philosophy. It is not due to the difference of or sameness in men and women. It is due to following the same love, the same inspiration, the same teacher. We have both been re-educated under Christ. In my own case, for example, the new philosophy I had formed of life did not even repress my old desires. I was no better husband or father than I had ever been. It was not, in fact, until the love of Christ drove the love of self that I even wanted to become a better family man. And I had to let God dispel most of my previous beliefs of what a husband and father should be like, instructing me entirely anew before I became any significant use to my family. My wife, too, has been re-educated in this way and from all angles. Where once she fell asleep as I attempted to read to her the history of civilization, she is now finding worthwhile books and magazines to read, and she is now making history in her family instead of merely repeating the drab and uninspired precedent of many million homes. At one time, for instance, she wished that she could place a housekeeper in charge of me and the children while she went away to take a psychological course in child training. She wished she could start all over again and try to learn, not only to rear us in the way we should go, but get along with us in the meantime. Today, she has made that fresh start, but without going to college. Under the direction of God's guidance, and that alone, she is using the most advanced psychology with both me and the children. And she is gaining that confidence in handling us and living with us that she always knew she should have, but had always lacked. "Mother, please don't worry about me so," was once a frequent saying that has now become obsolete in our household. She has put the children in God's hands and awaits His wise direction in dealing with them. Instead of suffering under a superimposed parental authority, which is irritating, fleeting, and ineffective, they are learning discipline from within. A discipline imposed by the divine authority who now has charge of them. Where once, in other words, physical affinity was about the only bond between us, a waning bond at that, we are now united through our children, through our minds, through our interests, through our common work of winning people to Christ, and through the all-enveloping love of God. We have become a team united and held together, not by the usual irksomeness ties of matrimonial harness, but by freely chosen and willingly accepted reign of God. One of the first lessons I learned under this new reign was a far more selfless love for my wife and family. I learned to love them not for the nice things they did for me, but for the deeper needs I began to discern in them, and for the way God then enabled me to fill them. I learned that holy wedlock is not a matter of self-indulgence, but a matter of self-sacrifice. And I learned that what self-sacrifice really means. Self-sacrifice, I found, was not a matter of stinting myself at the club so that my wife might have a new fur coat. It was not going without bread ourselves so that the children might have chocolate cake. It was not borrowing money and bearing silently and nobly a burden of debt so that my wife might rest her tired nerves at an expensive sanatorium. It was the far more difficult task of disregarding the fact that Mrs. Jones had a new fur coat, of swallowing my pride regarding coat providing prowess in the eyes of Mr. Jones, and of taking the trouble to dig far enough down into my wife's life to find the lack of a fur coat was not the real cause of her tense restlessness. It was equally difficult task of seeing that withholding chocolate cake from our children was often far better than giving it to them, even though the withholding apparently would lessen their liking for us. Lastly, it was the extremely difficult task of facing the fact that my wife was on the verge of breaking down. Not because of her family, not because of the strain of the times, not because she was approaching 40, not because of the perversity of the feminine nature in general, but largely because of the extremely stupid and egotistical way in which I had first spoiled and then neglected her, rebuked and misunderstood her for nearly 20 years. I do not mean that with my efforts to escape, I had become a sort of Bluebeard who was cruel and harsh. I mean that in common with millions of other unseen husbands, I had spoiled her in early marriage for my own pleasure and for the sake of my own vanity. I had tried to make life as luxurious as possible for her, not so much for love of her as for self-love. To flaunt my earning ability in the eyes of other wives and men. I gave her all my money that I did not want myself. I gave nothing whatever of myself for the sake of her soul. Then, tiring of this sport, I abandoned her, socially and spiritually, if not geographically. I sought my escape through other experiments and in office and speakeasy, while leaving her to lead a very thin existence with the children neither of us understood, with church work that held no real significance for her and the shallow life that had no context whatever in the world of reality. I thus enacted the great American tragedy within the walls of my own home. My wife, meanwhile, was playing her own part in this tragedy, wanting constantly to regain at least a small share of my time, attention, and affection, and caring very little for the money and other things I tried to give to her. She seldom had the courage to intrude on what I insisted were the important affairs of life, and her only method of intrusion was to plead that I give her a little more of my time. I called it nagging, and went my way. When God pointed out these various mistakes, He not only convinced us of our folly, but showed us what we could do about it. It was a matter of starting each other's reform all over again, but starting this time with ourselves. Instead of impatiently brushing by her requests for time, for instance, and telling her I had more important things to do, I listened to the voice of God, who told me that the most important thing in life for me, right then, was to help Him reconstruct the wife and mother I had helped bring to the edge of a nervous breakdown. He told me that I would have to lay my life down beside hers, giving her not a grudging 10 or 15 minutes every day or so, but as much time as she needed every day. He told me to listen patiently to what seemed unnecessary and uninteresting detail from my point of view, but what, in her point of view, God recognized as dangerous suppression, which needed to be externalized through sharing, and sublimated into constructive channels in the way He promised to direct. Through thus giving her the time I had formerly denied her, and thus holding her to centeredness in Christ rather than allowing her to lapse into self-centered introspection, God used me to restore the stability of character I had so carelessly upset. She meanwhile underwent a change which altered her approach to me and enabled her, in turn, to start the loving reconstruction of my character. Instead of nagging for more time, she began to pray with me about it, and thus kept me from retreating back into the caves where I had so long neglected not only her, but all other members of my family. We began, in fact, to pray together in creating the new vision of the couple God would have us be. One of our greatest blessings, as my wife says now, is finding ourselves telling one another our own weak spots and asking for one another's prayers about them, with no fear that the other will gloat about it or use that confidence as a weapon in the future. Instead, in other words, of criticizing each other, we now criticize ourselves to each other, and we ask the other's prayers about it. And when we occasionally do check to hold the other to a maximum in Christ, it is not without first examining the beam in our own eye. And then, only under guidance in a prayerful and redemptive way. Guided living also eliminates the frictions which are bound to arise when two self-centered people revolving on different axes are brought to the close proximity. There is little friction in our family now because when we see a difference of opinion in the offing, we have a quiet time and refer the matter to God. He settles it without argument or dispute in the way he knows best for both of us. The influence is even working down into the children. They are learning that things work out better for them, too, when they wait not our decision, but the verdict of God. And where, at one time, we considered ourselves fortunate in having an efficient nurse to keep the children out of the way, we are now able to include them in our social life, in our family plans, and even in most of our personal sharing without having to spell certain words or to hush up things that are either too risky or too risque to have them hear. In consequence, it is remarkable how much I enjoy my family now, whereas I used to be so annoyed or bored by them, and yet when I am away from them, there is no sense of separation such as there used to be. We have been brought so much closer together in spirit that no matter where we may be in body, I have the feeling that all the members of my family are always there. I have in fact seen spiritually united families rise triumphant not only over geographical separations, but in the separations of death. Funerals in the Oxford group do not bear the stamp of a funeral. They are entirely free from the sort of mourning which arises in self-pity and self-love. I have attended more than one in which I echoed, "Death, where is thy sting indeed?" These, of course, are only a very few, of many blessings which occur when an ordinary marriage is turned into holy wedlock, through the surrender of self-will and the sharing of one's sins. I have seen, for instance, young couples see God's guidance together and then check that guidance with the others in the group before they became engaged. I have seen a couple break off their engagement when God told them that their love was not on the right basis. I have seen couples on the brink of bitter divorce reunited after all good offices of friends, relatives, lawyers, psychologists, clergymen, and fairy godmothers had failed. I have seen one surrendered member in an otherwise unsurrendered family endure the most intolerable family abuse cheerfully, confidently, and lovingly, intent on bringing the abusive ones into their own right relationship with God. I have seen families wholly surrendered, where all members have become Christ-centered, and where all revolving around one axis. Live together in such utter serenity and with such amazing peace, intelligent happiness, and cooperation as had never before been my pleasure to behold. My own family, as I have said, is still far from perfect, but we are growing. We are gradually beginning to approach the happy consummation just described. And until Jesus Christ came into our home, we had known no way to grow except apart. And there we go. Wow. That brings in so many problems that we have in our society today. And I think it's amazing. That was written in 1934, right? So these problems started very long ago. The divorce, the selfishness, the self-centeredness in marriages, I guess these are probably just human problems, right? But it's amazing to think of them because that's really not that long ago. 100 years ago isn't that long ago, but there was clear red flags that were coming up in society regarding this already. And I think that's amazing to actually consider. So I'm excited to kind of go through this next week and really have a better discussion about it, because there is just an incredible amount of information and so much about how the structure of a marriage should be. And I think that's so important of a discussion to have. So I want to say thank you for listening today. I really do appreciate it. I'm looking forward to going through this chapter with y'all next weekend. And I hope you guys find some benefit out of that, because I can tell you it's given me some enthusiasm to do some work myself. So until next time, thanks.